I want to thank you for joining us in this very almost difficult time of study here in the book of 2 Corinthians. The Apostle Paul is using something that we in the Western world are not very acquainted with, and that's the use of paradox. Now, again, what is paradox? The paradox is two opposing thoughts. But the Romans would use two opposing thoughts to bring them to the truth. You know, we're talking here, and in the 6th chapter of the book of 2 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul is talking about the servant of God. And here in this talking and using the paradox, I really believe that the Apostle Paul is trying to bring a balance into the life of a servant of God. And how many of you realize that when things are out of balance, that things just don't go very well? And if you don't correct the thing that's out of balance in your life, you know what? You're going to end up in a deep ditch, and it's not going to be very nice. And so Paul is using two opposing thoughts. And why is he using two opposing thoughts? To get us confused? No, to bring us to balance, to bring us to truth in our lives. So now as we go into verse number 10, the Apostle Paul continues to use the paradox. And this is what he says, as sorrowful yet rejoicing. As sorrowful yet rejoicing. There are times of sorrow in our lives. The Greek word here, it actually means to grieve or to be bad. You know what? There are times in our lives where we need to grieve. Now, I know that there's people that teach, oh no, Christians should never grieve. You know what? These people are teaching something that's out of balance. Just yesterday, I went and did a funeral home visitation of a wonderful young couple and their family. They've lost their mother. Their mother's gone on to heaven. They're grieving. And you know what? It's all right to grieve. We go through times where we grieve. If you haven't gone through a time where you're having grief over your sin, your sorrow over your sin, and I would really doubt whether you've repented. You see, the Apostle Paul said there's times where we, as servants of God, that we go through sorrow. You know, I think that one of the greatest sorrows that servants of God go through is when people reject the truth. When people walk away from Jesus, people that they've invested their lives in walk away from Jesus. Great sorrow. So Paul says to these, in addressing servants of God, he says, you know what, guys, there's going to be times of sorrow. There's going to be times when you're going to grieve. But then he says, and there's going to be times of great rejoicing. Times of always rejoicing. Rejoicing. What is it? What does he mean by rejoicing? It's the Greek word charo, and it means to rejoice. It means to be glad. Even in our times of grieving, we can maintain this place of being glad. Glad. Notice he says always rejoicing. You're going to go through times of sorrow in your life as a servant of God. And the balance of that is in that time of sorrow, you can have joy. You can have gladness. You can know that God is still in control. There's been times in my life where I've gone through times of grief, times of grief when I've watched people that I've invested in turn away from the truth. Times of grief when I've lost my parents, I've lost brothers, sisters-in-law, brothers-in-law, good friends. They've gone on to heaven. But I still grieve. But you know what? Yet inside, knowing that they are in a better place, I am always glad. Not glad they left, but glad that they've moved on. And that's what Paul is talking about. Again, we need to realize that Paul is talking to a bunch of people who have seen their friends, their brothers and sisters in Christ persecuted, and possibly even come to the point of death. And it's caused them to grieve, but the paradox is, you know what? The thing that brings us into balance is that we can always be glad that God is in control. Sometimes our lives get into such a mess and we grieve over mistakes that we've made. But you know what? We can be glad because God is in control. So the Apostle Paul says there's going to be times of sorrow, but then times of being glad. Always being glad, actually. And then the next paradox, as poor, yet making many rich. There will be times where we live as poor. The word poor actually means to beg or to crouch over. It means to be helpless. I've been there. Every servant of God is going to come to the point where maybe not physically poor, but you're going to feel like you're in a place of complete helplessness. What in the world do I say to these people? What do I do for these people? I can't do enough for these people. And that's what Paul is talking about when he says poor. But then he goes on and he says, yet making them rich. The word rich here means a large number or a quantity or an amount. You see, we need to understand that even though we are confronted with our helplessness, we still, by God's grace, can make other people rich. We can bring people to a point where they have extreme wealth, not necessarily talking about physical wealth or financial wealth, but a real wealth on the inside of them. And now we move on to the last paradox, and he says, having nothing but possessing all things. There are times when we hold nothing. The word having actually means to hold nothing. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Actually, the Greek word for nothing means an absolute of nothingness. But the reality is we possess all. How many of you know that when God is on your side, whether you think you're winning or losing, you're always on the side of victory? So the Apostle Paul says, and again, he's using this paradox, he says, having nothing, nothing to give, absolutely nothing. But really, when we have absolutely nothing, the paradox is it brings us into a balance where we have everything. We have all things. Thank you for watching today. Join us again as we continue our study in the book of 2 Corinthians.